الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Welcome to Understanding Islam. My name is Chris Hewer, and I'm going to be presenting this series of programs to build up into a whole way of understanding something about Islam and the way of life of Muslims. As each of these programs is broadcast, it will be available on demand on the Ahlulbayt website, so it can be downloaded and people can catch up on earlier episodes if they've missed them. To go with each episode, there will also be an article available to be downloaded from my own website. This series begins with 12 episodes looking at the big picture of understanding Islam. Every 4 weeks, we will have a question and answer session, and you are most welcome to email in questions that I will address on this extended program every 4th week. What's special about being human? In the last episode, we saw that the whole of creation created by God is Muslim. That is, it lives according to the great designer's plan. And we saw that daffodils naturally turn toward the sun. So the question is, what's the difference between me and a daffodil? Well, if you think about it, daffodils have no choice about turning toward the sun. That's what they do. That's the way that they are programmed to act. They don't have a choice. As a human being, I do have a choice. I have free will. I can either choose to do something or choose not to do it. This question of free will is very important within Islam, because only if we have free will can we freely agree to live according to the great designer's plan. That is our uniqueness. Now, in Islam, we don't have what we call value-free freedom. Value-free freedom means I'm free to do just whatever I want. If you stop somebody in the street and you say, "What does it mean to you to be free?" you'll often get the answer, "It means I can do whatever I want. Nobody tells me what to do." That's value-free freedom. That's not an Islamic understanding. Instead, Islam understands that freedom is value-laden. That means we are created free in order that we may freely choose to be fully human. That means to live according to the great designer's plan. So there are values built into the human being that we should choose freely to follow, and then we will flourish, and then we will become fully human. And so we are created by God free to be fully human, to choose to live the way that God intended. Just how free are we? Well, there's a big discussion in the scholarly literature about the freedom or the predetermination of the human will. And this is one of those places where we can see that there's a whole spectrum of opinion within the Muslim community. There were those Muslims at one end who thought, God is just. Therefore, God must judge me with justice. Now, if God is being merciful to me, and you didn't make the same mistake, God is being unjust to you. So therefore they said, well, there can be no mercy, there can only be justice. Wait a minute, the other scholars of Islam said, that's going too far, because God is merciful. And we have to allow room for the mercy of God in our understanding of free will. There were other Muslims who said, we really don't have any freedom at all. God compels us to act the way that we do, just as though God had written the script of a play, and all we can do is to play out the part that has been written for us. Now, if you take that position, you can see that there's no room for human accountability. If I am programmed to act in a certain way, how can you hold me responsible? And so the scholars of Islam said, that's the other end of the spectrum. That is going too far the other way. And so we have a whole spectrum from one end to the other. And different groups of Muslims will be in different positions along that spectrum. Some will emphasize more the freedom of the human will. Some will emphasize more the predeterminism of God. Now we can ask the question, why does God take the risk of creating free beings? Because there is, of course, a risk. Any genuine freedom means that I have the potential to rebel. I have the potential to sin and to not live the way that God intended. So why does God take the risk? Well, let's approach the question this way. What is the difference between a programmed mechanical act and a free act? I have at home a tea-making machine. It sits beside my bed. When I go to bed at night, I fill it with water, put in a tea bag, plug it in, program it, and tomorrow morning when we wake up, there is a hot cup of tea, if it's worked. But I never feel the need to give the tea-making machine a kiss and say, "Thank you very much, machine, you've made the tea." It had no choice. It was programmed. Now let's take a second example. We don't have a tea-making machine at home. And so I wake up 10 minutes before my wife, I quietly creep downstairs, I make a pot of tea, and I bring her a hot cup of tea when she wakes up in the morning. Now you can see that this is quite a different act, because I have done what no machine can do. I have freely chosen to do an act which is good, based on human free will, based on compassion, on love, on charity, on altruism. No machine can do that. So we're told that God has as many angels in heaven as God wants, who are constantly worshipping God. But they're programmed to do so. What God wants is the worship of free beings, because the quality of a free act is quite different to the quality of a programmed act. And therefore, God, as it were, takes the risk of giving human beings freedom so that we can freely choose to worship God, to live according to God's guidance, to live the way that God wants us to live. That's the uniqueness of being human. Every human being that's ever existed is given by God two high vocations, two great human dignities, two commands, if you like. The first is that we are to be the Abd of God, and I will translate Abd as the loving servant of God. And the second is we are to be the Khalifa of God, and I'll translate Khalifa as regent. So let's look at Abd first of all. Every human being is called to be the Abd, the loving servant of God. Now, in Islamic understanding, service without love is dehumanizing slavery. Love without the discipline of service leads to chaos. Therefore, we are called to be the loving servant of God, the Abd. Now, you can see how important this is even in Muslim names. You will find many Muslim men who are called Abdullah, the loving servant of God. Abdul Rahman, the loving servant of the most merciful one. Abdul Haq, the loving servant of the truth, and so on. So the very name of the person reminds them of their great human dignity to be the loving servant of God. In Islamic understanding, four things go together: worship, obedience, service, and love. There is a verse of the Quran that tells us that God created human beings for no other reason than that we should worship God. That's why we were made. If we are going to worship God, then we will obey God. We will live according to God's guidance. We will obey God's commands, do those things that we are ordered to do by God. And we will obey God's prohibitions. We will keep clear of those things that are forbidden. If we are going to live in obedience to God, we will also serve God. So service is the third characteristic. I am to serve God. I am to serve myself. I am not to damage my own health. Alcohol, for example, is forbidden because it damages human health, it damages human consciousness. In a sense, it degrades the human being. The ultimate damage to myself is suicide. Suicide is forbidden in Islam, because it takes away from God that ultimate God-given right to determine when I should die. So I am not serving myself through suicide. I am to serve my family. My family have responsibilities over me. I am to make sure that they have a roof over their heads, that they have food and clothing and education and health provision and so on. But service goes wider than that. I am to serve the community in which I live. I am to serve the whole society. Ultimately, I am to serve the rest of creation. So the human being is to worship, to obey, to serve, and finally, to love. The motive for all these actions should be the love of God alone, the highest and the purest of motives. There is a saying which is traced back both to a woman mystic from 8th century Basra called Rabia, and to Imam Ali. This saying goes as follows: O God, if I obey you out of fear of hell, send me there, because I am unworthy of you. O God, if I obey you out of hope of the reward of heaven, deny it to me, because I am unworthy of you. But, O God, if I obey you out of pure love for you alone, then hide not your face, for you are a loving God. And so we can see that the motive for all human actions should be the pure love of God alone. We were created to worship, to obey, to serve, and to love God. The second human dignity or human vocation is tied up with this word Khalifa. The Khalifa is the regent, the one sent with full power and authority. In the days of the British Empire, for example, the Queen Empress was in London and would send the Viceroy to India as her regent. Hear my regent, hear me. Obey my regent as you would obey me. And to the regent she said, you are to cherish those people in my name as though I were doing it. So the human being is to be the regent of God, the one sent with full power and authority to cherish the society, to cherish the whole creation itself. We can think of this in different ways. We can think of the human being as the ecologist, the one who is looking after the harmony and balance of nature. Maybe it has gone too far in one direction. We have a thinning of the ozone layer, for example. It is the human being's responsibility to put that balance right. It is the human being's responsibility to bring out the full potential beauty of nature. We know, for example, that all our domestic animals are not natural. They are human beings breeding those animals over many generations to bring out certain characteristics. If you try milking a Highland cow, it's a very different experience to milking a domestic cow. In the same way with roses that grow in our gardens, they're not natural either. They are the product of human beings working with the creation to bring out its full natural beauty and potential. Now, just because you can do something does not mean that you should do it. There has to be a moral decision here. We know, for example, that certain breeds of dogs have been bred by human beings too much. There is a weakness that has been bred into them. And so our responsibility has gone too far. We have bred them beyond the reasonable limit. So the human being, for example, faced with the question of genetically modified foods, is not free to do just whatever we can, but there must always be a moral judgment. So we would say the human being is required to follow the ethical will of God. It's not just in the physical universe that human beings are to be the Khalifa of God. It's also in the social world in which we live. Human beings are to build just societies. They are to see that justice reigns. They are to see that the poor and the weak in society are looked after. They are not marginalized. Human beings are responsible for building the whole of society according to the great Creator's plan. So, human beings are to be the Abd and the Khalifa of God. We've seen then that all human beings have these two great dignities. With dignities come responsibilities. With responsibilities come accountability. It's not unreasonable that if I send someone as my regent with full power and authority, I will hold them to account. And so at the end of our earthly lives, every single human being will be held to account by God. How have we discharged our duties to be the Abd and the Khalifa of God? Now this applies to every single human being, whether they know God or whether they don't, whether they have heard of Muhammad or Jesus or Moses, or maybe they have lost contact with any prophet that was sent to them. This means that it would be unjust to judge people about something that they do not know. And so every human being is to face judgment according to what we know. At the same time, we have seen in an earlier episode the concept of the Deen al-Fitra, that is, the natural God-given way of the human being. So there is something natural about the human being to live in this dignified, balanced, just, peaceful way. Indeed, the Quran tells us of an episode before human beings were sent to the earth. We call this the conference of the pre-embodied souls, when God calls all the souls together and asks, "Am I not your Lord?" And they respond, "Yes, indeed, you are." And so in Islamic understanding, there is within the human being a natural disposition to live according to the great designer's plan. This we will answer for on the day of judgment. Now there's obviously a difference between not knowing something and, on the other hand, knowing it and rejecting it. So to know and to reject the guidance of God carries consequences with it. At the end of time, there will be the day of judgment, the day of reckoning, we can say, when every human being will be brought before God for judgment. God alone is the judge, no human being, because God alone knows the human heart. God alone knows the human intention. So no human being can sit in ultimate judgment on another. That is God's job, not ours. After the day of judgment come the consequences. The Islamic tradition speaks of heaven or paradise, a state of infinite growing, deeper in knowledge and wisdom and understanding of God, a state in which the human being has all that their heart desires, all our needs are fulfilled. At the same time, the Islamic tradition speaks of hell or the fire, a place of indescribable torment, a place of suffering and of loss. Remember that you are very welcome to email understandingislam@Ahlulbayt Television and send in your questions for our monthly live question and answer session.